Hello. I would like to offer some perspectives on just war theory. Um, this is a theory that seems to have begun around the year 400 in the Common Era with one of the Christian church fathers, St. Augustine. And at that time, Christianity had become the official religion of the Roman Empire. And I think people in the religion who had formerly been very pacifistic were faced with the job of figuring out how to justify going to war to defend the empire. Um, and that idea is in many sources on that history. Um, the job that St. Augustine set out to do was to spell out the conditions under which a war could be considered just. In other words, it's kind of an ethical problem that he was trying to solve. And he and others later developed what is now called just war theory by almost everyone. It talks about conditions for justice at three successive stages. The start of a war, the conduct of the war during the time the war is raging, and more recently, the theory has been extended to justice after a war. So, for example, just different authors have somewhat different lists of conditions that must be satisfied, but this is fairly typical. Before going to war, just war theory wants the cause that we're fighting for to be just. It wants the war to be declared by an appropriate authority, by a right authority or just authority. It wants the intention behind going to war to be just. It wants there to be a reasonable chance of success, of winning the war. It wants proportionality. In other words, it wants the degree of violence or the level of war making to be appropriate to the problem that is in front of the country. It's we don't go hunting flies with a shotgun, and similarly, we don't want to declare a war over a minor matter. And finally, the war should be a last resort after other measures have been tried, have been exhausted, and there's no other choice but to go to war. Once the war has started, there are other conditions that should be satisfied to achieve justice, according to just war theory. For example, proportionality. And that refers to, I suppose, battles that are part of the war. The battles themselves should be appropriate to the level of the problem, the level of the conflict for that particular moment during the war. Discriminacy refers to a distinction between combatants, who are soldiers, and non-combatants, who are innocent civilians. And military necessity is rejecting war crimes and declaring that what you do during a war has to be necessary. It can't be excessive, it can't be punitive, it can't just be armies and soldiers acting out under the cover of the war. Following a war, post-bellum in the Latin, again, a number of authors have offered conditions that should be satisfied in order for the aftermath of a war to reach a level of justice. Some compensation for losses needs to be considered fairly. Rehabilitation of people and infrastructure. Very importantly, warrior transition. We know that soldiers, warriors come out of a war broken and suffering from anxiety disorders and possibly thought disorders. They're at great risk of suicide. And so some attention to warrior transition is part of this more recent extension of just war theory. And finally, without making the list too long, consideration and study of lessons learned from the war should be a part of the just approach to the aftermath of a war. I want to offer two kinds of perspectives on just war theory that are critical yet appreciative. The first perspective comes from the social sciences and in particular from psychology. First of all, just war theory was formulated and defined as a sort of a set of problems to work on back in 400 AD. That's like almost 1600 years before the social sciences got underway. And so in recent times, in the recent century or century and a half, we have learned a lot about human nature in general, and also about violence and alternatives to violence that was unknown to St. Augustine, and he may not even have appreciated the things that we know today. I don't know. Don't know much about St. Augustine. But just war theory also predates the work of Gandhi and of other nonviolent social movements, nonviolent revolutionary change events that have occurred, again, in about the last century and a half. And just war theory doesn't have much to say about the questions that are raised by the social sciences and by the successes of some of those nonviolent achievements. Just war theory assumes rational decision making by human beings who can weigh these conditions and decide in kind of a dispassionate way whether they have been satisfied or not. That's pretty unrealistic from the point of view of a modern cognitive psychologist or clinical psychologist. Human reasoning and decision making is not rational, although it can approach being rational under some circumstances. But our thinking is subject to a number of cognitive glitches and biases that have received a lot of study since the Second World War in particular. And a couple of cognitive psychologists, Bill Simon and Daniel Kahneman, have won the Nobel Award for economics, mainly by informing economics about ways in which people's decision making about economic matters is not rational. And so this is a different time than St. Augustine's time. And perhaps our reasoning about human beings and how they make decisions, what they can do, needs to change. And finally, I've got a few more things under the social sciences, but I'm looking at the third item on a little list in my notes. Just war theory is weak on what comes before the last resort. The last resort being sort of a threshold where we've decided that we have to go to war. nonviolence and the social sciences have a lot to say about that, about what goes on during peaceful times and what makes for a healthy community and what attitudes and behaviors are productive in fostering human relationships and creating a world in which people can live and work and play and have fun and make jokes and so on and live normally without war hanging over their head. The just war theory has some consideration of collateral damage, collateral consequences of the violence that goes on in war, but not enough. In practice, in the heat of wartime situations, it is likely that there will be even more discounting of collateral consequences than there was when people decided to go to war. That is a serious problem. The avoidance of dissent, as we see in phenomena like groupthink, which has been studied a lot in social psychology, and enemy thinking, the kind of thinking that goes on between groups that are at odds with each other, but not really talking to each other. And within each of those groups, there is also a tendency to suppress dissenters. The avoidance of dissent complicates the whole process of making decisions. Some of these psychological factors, by the way, come to light in the work of some narrative historians like Doris Kearns Goodwin and Barbara Tuchman. And for example, Barbara Tuchman's account of how World War I started it brings it down to almost soap opera-like episodes involving particular people who had incomplete information or who were emotionally upset or who had grudges against people. And major historical events turn on those episodes that are psychologically very fraught. So those factors come in, I think, from the field of psychology. There are also self-interested people whose motives may not be taken into account fully under traditional just war theory. There are lobbyists. There are gun manufacturers who will profit from going to war. There are people who like to fight, who will argue in favor of war because that's the way they see the purpose of their lives being defined. There are romantics who have a very unrealistic view of war, but confirmatory bias will help them to continue to be romantics, possibly up to the point when they get killed. There are so many things like this that are just not appreciated in standard treatments of just war theory. And there are also some perspectives from the field of nonviolence that I'd like to mention. As we've seen from the past centuries' work by Gandhi and others, there's a lot you can do before the last resort that represents alternatives to going to war, but also alternative paths for people to develop and preserve human relationships and to come up with creative ways of solving problems. As you get closer and closer to a crisis, of course, I think as Galtung has pointed out, our options narrow. And we have the greatest range of options when we are still keeping ourselves as far as possible from the last resort. Nonviolence has shown how many different things there are to try, and that's a good reason for reading about the movements of Gandhi and King, of Mandela and Aung San Suu Kyi, of the Yellow Revolution in the Philippines, of the overthrow of dictators in Chile and Serbia, of the dynamics of the Solidarity movement in Poland. We have so many examples now of nonviolent things that can be done to solve problems that we have less and less excuse as history goes on for going to war using traditional thinking. I think what nonviolence has done, if we care to think of it this way, is nonviolence has provided a way of raising the threshold of violence, including raising the threshold for going to war. And I think, although they may not call this a nonviolence thing in their work, that's what diplomats do. That's what trade negotiators contribute to in their work with other countries. They put building blocks of new solutions and new economic activity and new human contacts into place. And one of the consequences of that is that the threshold of war is pushed further away. There is the possibility of transforming situations rather than simply playing the usual game in which one side makes a move, another side makes a move, and so on. In the social sciences, game theory is pretty good at modeling many situations like that involve alternate moves. Nonviolence perhaps provides examples of situations where you stop playing the game and you transform the situation into something else. And then the original problem is solved, not in the old-fashioned zero-sum way, by one side winning and the other side losing, but by creating a new situation in which both sides are now playing a different role. There is, I think, just war theory is an ethical theory, an ethical attempt to impact behavior in the real world. But I think there is an inherent overlap of ethical choices and practical results in nonviolence, in the field of nonviolence, that offers a different way of looking at things. And in nonviolence, we often find that the staying on the high road and taking advantage of the opportunities that provides is the most practical way to proceed. I think some of the success of Dr. King in the civil rights movement is due to that. By remaining nonviolent through a number of times, a number of episodes where he was really challenged to give it up, and his followers were very tempted by violence. But by staying on a high road, he was eventually able to get the power of the federal government behind the civil rights movement. And that's one example of how ethical choices and practical results can play out without a war, and perhaps by preventing a war. Now, the different resources that are available on just war theory, websites and books, articles in the journal literature, They are excellent resources for a person who's interested in nonviolence. So I promised that this would be partly critical and partly appreciative. And I am deeply appreciative of the resources that Just War Theory people have provided for all of us who are interested in um, nonviolence and related disciplines, whether they are conflict resolution, mediation, diplomacy, negotiation, um, and so on and so on. So what I offer as a suggestion is just that Just War Theory be appreciated for what it does do, but remain open to expansion, because as it stands, Just War Theory, in my opinion, is incomplete. It doesn't include sufficient consideration of limitations on human rationality. Um, it it doesn't consider psychology enough. It doesn't consider what comes before you reach the last resort. And in order to create a larger theory, a larger framework within which to think about what it means to go to war, I think it probably needs to take those steps. Again, if you found this interesting, please subscribe to the Learning Nonviolence channel, and give this video a like, and I will be back very soon with some other ideas.